Dear Macedonians, I have listened carefully to the concerns expressed regarding the Macedonian language and identity. There can be no doubt that the Macedonian language is your language. And I am happy to repeat it, there can be no doubt that the Macedonian language is your language. Yours is a successful multi-ethnic society. It mirrors the EU's motto, United in Diversity. You have shown commitment to the rule of law, the protection of human rights, and to the rights of all communities. These are values that we all share.
In a sense, it has little significance globally on the surface. It's just, why? And yet, if you scratch below the surface, there are lessons to be learned for how a small country with limited resources at a time of war and opposed by, at that time, an intransigent neighbor, was able to stay out of the war, maintain peace, not break up when there were centrifugal forces pulling it in all sorts of directions, negotiated its own internal ethnic issues, which could have exploded at any moment, and ultimately negotiated successfully with the neighbor, and has positioned itself to move forward. Now, the international community, the international economy has changed significantly in the 30 plus years since the war started. But there are lessons to be learned about how Macedonia made the right decisions when at almost any turn it could have fallen off the road. It could have gone into the ditch, but it didn't. And as I said before, part of that was because of Gligorov and his very skillful management of the political environment. But what lessons can the world learn, can academics learn on how Macedonia has gotten to where it is today? I mean, it has had its nationalist politicians as well, and yet still it hasn't veered off into the ditch as so many other countries have.
When you're back in Washington, I think, and I include myself in this, you look at it and you see countries and you see policies and you see problems. You don't always sort of look carefully or assess what are the leaders actually up to, and what is their, and when you're on the ground, you see that and you try to communicate that to Washington. And I think in the case of Macedonia, we in Macedonia and the region were very fortunate that the leaders involved were very thoughtful, and there were some who were not, but the thoughtful leaders, I think, largely prevailed even through the politics as they developed. So that's one thing to recognize. I think another is to recognize that, I naturally, as you can probably gather from the paper, side with those who don't believe that these are, whatever, Kaplan described it in Balkan Ghosts, and that Clinton took. These are not intractable ethnic problems. These are politicians taking advantage of ethnic religious differences. And so if you have a country where that isn't the main feature, the outcome can be different. And I think that's what we see in Macedonia. And so, we should be attuned to that.
I think that the case of Macedonia is interesting in that it provides a very interesting example of a complicated geopolitical situation where you had Macedonia, which rather shrewdly and carefully negotiated its exit from from Yugoslavia. Gligorov was very careful, very shrewd. He was an apparatchik, but he had a pretty good sense of how to manage things, as did a number of others. But they had a difficult situation between Bulgaria, which, even at the time said, nah, Macedonian language doesn't exist. It's just a variant of Bulgarian. You had the Greeks, which were adamant that there would be no revanchist rhetoric around the fact of Macedonia. You had the Serbs, who had their own interests. And then you had a very large proportion of Albanians, which were right up against the border of Albania. So there was the potential for a far greater insurgency there if it was mishandled. And then you had all the European powers that were trying to get this done, or what, things like that. But Macedonia had to sort of negotiate its exit, get its name or a name, and get into these different organizations in the face of a lot of opposition from Greece and or other elements in Europe, which were opposing or supporting one side or another, and Russia was involved. What's interesting is to see how patience and diplomacy and time accomplished those goals effectively. It's a great case study of sort of not just the internal politics of a country or an entity and how they develop, but the interplay of all these other players and pushing and pulling and trying to get their way.
They were trying their best to stay afloat. And, when you look at them today, I always think of Macedonia as the little train that made it up the hill, despite everybody throwing rocks at it and, trying to derail it. Because against all odds, and I remember one guy from the DoD coming to see me, one of their analysts, and he had written this whole paper about how Macedonia was going to descend into ethnic violence, and it was going to cause these waves of migration into Kosovo and Greece, and cause another catastrophe in the region. I looked at him, I said, "What are you basing this on? I don't see any evidence of this over there." So there was a lot of misinformation going around, or just conjecture about how Macedonia was going to fail. And look at them today.
I think the greatest accomplishment, and perhaps the one that I, think about the most, is that we, at the end of the day, kept Macedonia out of this situation. It's not to say they haven't had their problems. In fact, they've had little issues over the years, but they stayed out of these tough Balkan wars. And I think what is memorable also for me is the degree to which we had very senior American politicians who understood the importance of it. Often Bosnia would attract the attention, Kosovo would attract the attention, but people understood that let's try to make sure that countries around the action did not become part of the action. And, the overall message to Macedonia is, we're going to stick with you and you're not going to be alone. I think, whether it's true in one's personal life or true in the life of the nation, having a sense of being alone, that nobody else cares, is probably the most frightening situation an individual or a nation can face. And so, you never want a situation where when people are alone, they feel afraid. And when they're afraid, they may reach for authoritarian government or something. So surrounding Macedonia with countries that cared, I think, was very important.
And look at other instances when the US had a chance to go and help a country in the beginning, but did not. If they would get involved in the beginning when it is necessary, then it really makes a difference. But if you wait, just push it aside, then it gets worse. Because again, with Macedonia, it had been referred to as the powder keg of the Balkans. If the US had not gotten involved when they did, it really would have been a totally different story of the different history of the Balkans. The Balkans would be different right now.
One of the huge issues in diplomacy is that you never get credit for the problem that for preventing something bad that didn't happen. So, if you had successfully negotiated Bosnia's transition to independence without a war, nobody would have cared and nobody would have given credit. Whereas, those who, like Richard Holbrooke, were involved in the Bosnia peace plan almost are getting, they're getting huge accolades. So, but I think we could all agree it would have been much better had there been no war in Bosnia. So, dealing with the issues in North Macedonia, you know, it's better to deal with them now than if things blow up.
You know, I don't want to pretend that North Macedonia is unique and that it's the only country that we should pay attention to. But neither do I want to say that you know, diplomacy, like politics, is the art of the possible. You know, the ideal remains the ideal. But Macedonia, as a country, with a significant minority population, born into the fraught environment into which it was born, to have developed as it's developed, is something that I think that we need to take some pride of accomplishment in and work to maintain, and give us some hope as we engage in other areas in the world to see how we go forward.
I think if Macedonia can make it, a lot of countries can make it. So I think it's a good example of how to deal with ethnic issues, how to deal with a very unkind history, and how to deal with problems in the neighbors and making sure that they can make their way and be well respected by all. You know, America, we had Mexico and Canada. Most of these countries are not endowed with such wonderful neighbors as Mexico and Canada. They're endowed with something completely different. And I think when you look at Macedonia's borders, you can see why it's been a tough slog. But I think Macedonia has done well and is an inspiration to all of us.
The rise of North Macedonia teaches us important lessons about resiliency and commitment and perseverance, especially when you think about turning from socialist rule to free and fair elections in a matter of a few decades is a testament to the drive and the spirit of the people of North Macedonia, from independence to conflict to joining NATO and on the track to the European Union. North Macedonia is a case study in development and progress in the Western Balkans, and we need regional and global stability to uphold peace and Western values. And North Macedonia really is and will be a critical piece of that puzzle.
What people have to remember, I mean, in geopolitics as a whole, you know, it's probably not all that critical, but it, you know, it can be a small piece that makes a difference. And Macedonia, even before there was an independent country, recognized as that, was known. I mean, it was I think Bismarck who talked about Macedonia as being kind of the answer to the Balkans.
There's a way in which geographically and geopolitically North Macedonia is always going to be at this crossroads. It's always going to be, it's not clear when it ever gets to not feel like a border state between spheres of influence.
As a NATO member, I mean, that's an important factor. Because Macedonia could become important if the arrangement in Bosnia, which is bizarre to say the least, and I think I'm not an expert on this any longer, but I think it's probably still fragile. I mean, it's lasted for, you know, a quarter century, but it's still, you know, on you know, with Republika Srpska still being you know, against some of those positions out of date, and I think it's still fragile. So if the arrangement in Bosnia were to weaken or even collapse, then Macedonia would be very important, because it would be NATO's link into the region, and its role in stabilizing the region, meaning NATO's link role in stabilizing the region, would be crucial.
The US chooses its strategies, and they believe that Macedonia is important part of the southern flank of NATO now. And if it's important for NATO, it's important for the US, it's important for the security of your country, and Europe is important for the businesses of your country, and it all builds one onto another. I mean, even in socialism, we learned that politics is the extended hand of economy. So, and diplomacy is the extended hand of politics. So it is important for the Southeastern Europe, where we are now, to be stable, so that people can use the roads from Port of Thessaloniki to Vienna, to this corridor 10, and from the port of Dures to the port of Varna in Bulgaria, that's corridor 8. They, for good or bad, whichever the case may be, those two corridors, they cross in Skopje. And, you know, it is important for the country to be stable.
A stable multi-ethnic democracy has far-reaching effects on regional stability. And North Macedonia and its citizens have created such a democracy. And the Western Balkans are better for it. When you think about what a bastion of stability this country has become since 2001, which was when the Ohrid Framework Agreement was signed. Just recently, North Macedonia hosted normalization talks between Serbia and Kosovo in Ohrid. So it's certainly not just the United States that recognizes North Macedonia's ability as a stable and capable partner.
It's really important that we keep Macedonia on track. That's why I've been so disappointed with the EU, that they had an opportunity, particularly once the name issue was resolved. Get this moving, get them in. That was the idea. They are a European country.
The goal of through my entire lifetime, I'm now 72, has been a united democratic Europe. And so you want to include everybody, and you certainly don't want a place that's going to be a source of trouble.
I look at it from a cost-benefit analysis. The cost to Europe and the United States of including a country as small as North Macedonia in the club, the cost to them is not nearly as high as the risk of not doing it. And the risk of not doing it, and particularly in today's world, is the risk that you're leaving something that's an exposed flank. It's the southern underbelly of Europe, and you're leaving that exposed to whatever. Why? Why leave it exposed when the cost of solidifying that flank is relatively small, to be honest?
The geopolitical fate, I guess, if that's the right word, of North Macedonia hangs on what sort of economic and political relationship it can establish, particularly with the European Union.
Now, the Bulgarians, of course, have taken up the mantle to now resume, where Bulgaria and Macedonia had great relations for several years, really great relations, and the Prespa agreement was embraced, and then they decided they were going to go the other way. I have my own feelings about what motivated those in Bulgaria who decided to whip up this issue, and now of course are blocking the European path and making demands that frankly, if people were focused on it, threaten the Prespa agreement, I think. But the Europeans have sort of tried to navigate that. I've been disappointed personally, and I've said it publicly, that the Europeans have not kept up their end of the bargain in terms of moving forward on EU membership. Just beginning accession talks, painful, but I saw the same thing in the way the EU approached Kosovo. They make promises they didn't keep. Albania, Serbia, that's an EU challenge, and I think certain member states have taken a different approach on that.
EU lead or US lead? Yes. We do it better when we do it together. Relying on the EU to lead is a waste of time. Henry Kissinger once put it, this is back before Maastricht and the Lisbon Treaty, which created a European security and defense identity. Somebody once said, well, let's let the European Commission, European community, take care of this problem, or let Europe. And his response was, Europe, what's his telephone number? The problem with the European Union is, what are they down to? 27 now? There are 27 different countries, and any one country, whether it's Cyprus or Malta or Bulgaria, put their hand up and say, we don't think so. It'd be the equivalent of the state of Maine going, no, we're not going to agree to, that trade deal, because Maine disagrees.
we're a federal government. They are a federated government. Europe is really good for soft power. They bring money to the table. They bring visas. They bring access to European markets, and you guys can get on airplanes and come work in the European Union, which is something we're not prepared to do. We will bring some money, but our money always comes with conditions, and quite frankly, most of our aid money gets spent on Americans anyway. Just go ask USAID. Like USAID writes checks to American to NGOs. It may not be an American NGO. It could be like ICRC or somebody else to go do it on our behalf. Whereas we don't actually write a check for $1 million and drop it off in Arachinabo and say spend it any way you want to. So that was one comment. If we do it by ourselves, it doesn't stick. If we trust the Europeans to do it, it'll get messed up. If we do it together, we get it done.
It is a potential source of instability, and particularly there are opportunities now for Putin and the Kremlin with the war in Ukraine. North Macedonia, now that the name issue is solved, is in NATO. When it's on a path to the European Union, and maybe not a fast path, but a path, it's small, and so for the European Union to absorb it is a really relatively small price. The enlargement of the European Union has been such an extraordinary force for peace and democracy. The trouble is there are these annoying Balkan features. The Bulgarians, can't get over the idea that, that Macedonian isn't a real ethnicity. It's kind of Bulgarian. There isn't a Macedonian language. I mean, you kind of want to say, grow up, guys, get over it.
We have a situation today where there's a lot of Russian influence in the Balkans for a number of reasons. I would say that's our prime issue right now, is to curtail or contain Russian influence in the Balkans. It's kind of amazing that kind of retro issue is right back front and center.
With the invasion of the Ukraine in the 21st century, it brings home the sensation that peace can be very fragile, and you might think that there's stability in this region or this world, and then all of a sudden something like the invasion of the Ukraine happens, and you realize how hard we have to work to keep the peace and to keep stability and keep our eyes peeled for possible genocide and atrocities and war crimes, because they're still happening. So, when you think about Macedonia, and people may have been a little dismissive or even found it amusing that, these two countries were fighting over symbols or names, but, that could have been another disaster right there in the heart of Europe. So, I think we should always take any country's problems seriously if we're to maintain stability and the world as we want it to be.
The CEO of the Atlantic Council, Frederick Kemp, summed it up pretty well a few years ago, I think in 2017. And he was talking about the United States and the European Union and the Western Balkans and how we face an opportunity. And he in essence basically was sort of like, if we get it right, we can lead in creating a safe and secure and prosperous Western Balkans that's embedded in the West, and I think meaning NATO and EU. But if we get it wrong, you could have a crisis tomorrow. And so I think one thing that we can learn as diplomats and as you as a scholar is that nothing occurs, in a vacuum. What happens in the Balkans could have an effect on global security and foreign policy. So we should always pay, I think, very close attention to the Balkans. North Macedonia has made sacrifices for a better future, including the Prespa agreement. It would be naive to say that there are many among the public that have not embraced the name change. There are still people here who don't refer to it by its constitutional name, North Macedonia. But I think as Americans, we're always optimists, and we focus on the positive and on the future. And what's fascinating is the Prespa Agreement. It did so many things. It opened the door to NATO, and given Russia's re-invasion of Ukraine and the reverberating effects throughout Europe, North Macedonia is undoubtedly safer and a stronger country as a NATO ally. The country really should be proud of the role that they play on the sort of global geopolitical scale. It's this small country, about 2 million people. They've been fearless in standing up to Russian aggression in Ukraine. They were also very vocal in the beginning about Russia and the reinvasion of Ukraine, and they've done a lot of things, to help, with material supplies and other things. But calling out human rights abuses around the world. North Macedonia, as I know you're aware, they're leading the OSCE this year. That's really an important role that they're playing. And so we, as the United States, know that we've got a reliable, honest partner when it comes to some of the most important foreign policy questions, and that cannot and really should not be undervalued.
My own career was based around don't do anything you weren't told to do. But it's better to ask forgiveness than permission sometimes. And, I think, if anything, close by saying, the United States is a global power. And we've tried to build and establish and promote a rules-based world order to protect our own citizens' rights to liberty, justice, and economic security. And we've promoted that by promoting an American ideal that, perhaps we've never completely fulfilled, but it has been a powerful tool. And we need to keep that in mind everywhere in the world in our engagement. And, we need to make progress as we can, and we need to try and avoid backsliding. And, as evil or as obstacles emerge, we have to be aware of them. And, the thing I would say is I can only encourage, continued principled engagement. And, as Lincoln said, admittedly in another context, we have to proceed with firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right. And I hope that as we continue to engage with Macedonia and other countries around the world, that we will continue to keep that in mind.
Democracy is never perfect. Every country has its challenges, including the United States. And even North Macedonia continues to, even as they showcase their value as a NATO ally and sort of the steps they're taking to join the European Union, our focus on curbing domestic corruption has never been stronger. It's something that the ambassador and I speak about frequently in public and speeches and in media interviews. But we've proven time and again, and through our very tangible assistance and through our messaging, that the United States will do its part to confront this challenge. But the question remains, whether or not North Macedonia's political class will do the same. Undue political influence is corruption, period. Corruption really does have a ripple effect, and it has a significant influence on institutions and really the youth. We're seeing a lot of young people who leave this country, and fewer individuals want to work in the public sector. And I'm a public servant working for the State Department, and I speak to a lot of young audiences, but they're starting, and they have for a while, but they're losing more hope in the system and in a way in aspects of the country. And so it's really important that this get addressed. And when you have political parties that are engineering judicial appointments and political appointments, you understand why people lose faith, or when you have to pay bribes, if you will, for essential services. So that undercuts democracy. And as I said earlier, we're a partner, and we will always do what we can to help, but we cannot be the sole solutions. It's really up to the leadership. Ultimately, I hope political leaders, rather than using their positions for political gain, will more fully embrace democratic tenets of citizen equality and opportunity. It's not about personal or political power. It's about empowering people.
I would say, if I'm working at the FSI and teach the new foreign service officers, I would tell them, forget what you've seen in your previous post, unless it is a next door neighbor to the country that you're going to visit. So if you're coming to a completely different part of the region, of the world, if you're coming to a different continent, if you're coming to a different religion, just forget what you've learned in the past, in the previous post, because it is going to be completely different. Each country has its own customs, its own way of behavior. And for us as a local staff, it's very difficult when somebody comes, I don't know, from Asia or from Australia or from, I don't know, Middle East, Afghanistan or some other place where there's different kind of issues. I'm not gonna say even military issues and stuff like that, and come to the country of Macedonia and try to implement the same system and the same things that they have been doing there. It's not applicable. It's something completely different. So first of all, you have to read a little bit about the history of the place to know where you're going. And then just give yourself a couple of months before you start changing things. For Macedonia and for the Balkans in general, I would say that unfortunately we live a lot in history. We live in the past, and some of the things that have happened in the past will never teach us that the future we should behave differently. We are still dragging some issues from history from the past, and there is still influencing, unfortunately, our decisions nowadays, and how the governments move, or whatever the government, sometimes even the more modern government likes to implement. There is always, it was not like that in the past, and we are dragging, and we are relying on historic relations and problems. I don't know.
We need to be very selective and very careful when we attempt to export our social values to other countries. Our aspirations, our history, our own unique identity may not work in another country that is, shall we say, a lot older, or another place with multiple societies that are a lot older than our society. I guarantee you there is no American, that was born in 1860 who would recognize the United States today. We've evolved very, very rapidly. You go to Afghanistan or Iraq or Turkey. If you were born in 1860, you would recognize the society that if you dropped them in today, hasn't changed very much. But we're constantly like, well, you need to be like us. You need to whatever. I don't know if you know it, but State Department has 55 special envoys. 55 special envoys. There is a special envoy for any social issue you can think of. And every one of them matters to an American, and every one of them makes sense for any place on the planet because it makes sense for us. It may not make sense for some other place.
Obviously, history informs where we are and where we might go in the future. New officers at Embassy Skopje can look at this history and learn about the need to balance rival political parties, the importance of proper treatment of minorities by a government, and the influence of international organizations like OSCE and the IMF and the UN and the EU on how a country develops politically and economically. So look to the past to gather all that information, who the important players were. Why did the Albanian Muslim minority decide to accommodate the government of Ligorov and the subsequent Macedonian government rather than become intransigent? What did the government do? Are those sorts of sparks still alive in Macedonia itself? Again, the political and economic world we live in is so different from where it was back in 1992. So I would say that learn from the history to draw the lessons you can and search out those areas of excellence within Macedonia and see what you as part of the embassy community can do to nurture that.
From the American perspective, the supply of history greatly exceeds the demand. Stop talking about history. Let's move on to the future, which is an understandable reaction to this glut of history. But I think it behooves us all, especially Americans who tend to underappreciate the role of history. It behooves us all to understand it much better than we do. And it's not to become a prisoner of it. It's not to give an answer to contemporary statehood problems by saying, oh yes, in 1389, we had a terrible battle with the Turks. That's not really helpful or even informative at this point. But it is, I think, for Americans to understand where people are coming from. Where's their mentality? Why are their emotions in a way that we don't really understand those emotions? And so I think it behooves us all to understand history and where they're coming from. And again, it's not to say we need to repeat it, Lord knows, but it is to say that we need to understand it and then build structures that fix the problems that have happened before.
You got to read and understand the history in order to be credible. So even though, the first hour of many conversations, particularly with President Gligorov, who I admired enormously, but we'd have meetings where foreigners, where some of our senior officials would come, and like the first 45 minutes was a recitation of Balkan and Macedonian history because he knew no one knew, so he wanted to explain it. So read that stuff, so you can sort of cut people off and say, I got that part, or engage on it, be credible. And then, everywhere personal relationships are important, but they're going to be more influential in a smaller country. So, make sure you really find a way to find friendships and common ground with people aside from going in and delivering the talking points. And that's easier in a smaller country. And it's more important in a smaller country.
Go out and meet the people of the country, because that's the greatest treasure. To me, the greatest part of being a diplomat is the privilege of living in a country and getting to know their history. If you learn their history and you listen to all of these videos, you'll become an impressive expert on Macedonia in a short amount of time. And people really enjoy exchanging their views with you more if you're, that more deeply informed about what's happened in the past as well as what's going on in the present. And I think a lot of Foreign Service officers, myself included, sometimes make the mistake of just focusing on whatever fires are raging right now in the embassy or whatever the current issues are. But if you know the past of that country and something about the evolution of our diplomatic relations, it will make you so much more effective today by knowing what's gone on in the past, and make sure we don't repeat the same mistakes.
And finally, gosh, find something that you like to do outside the office. Don't just focus on writing the best memo. Or I had a friend who, before he retired, was just focus on making sure that his memos got to the White House for consideration. I said, well, when you die, do you think that's going to be in your tombstone? That I wrote a great memo that was read by the vice president, that I was control officer for the president? No.
People can kind of sometimes get stressed about, assignments that they take, and they focus on particular jobs, that they should take if they want to get promoted, or, I think it's important to have a plan and to have goals, and to think about jobs that may, or positions that help you get to where you want to be. But my advice is to always try to focus on what interests you. Don't get overly stressed about taking jobs for the wrong reasons. Just focus on what you're interested in.
Sometimes for career purposes, people choose to spend a lot of time in Washington. I did so kind of accidentally after a few posts, but in fact, the real life of the Foreign Service and where you really are going to learn is going to be in the field. And when you get to the field, go there, go out, don't get stuck in the embassy. Meet people all over the country, because every country has differences, and learn about the country. Ideally, start by learning the language, but learn about the country. Then you're much better prepared to help explain the country to the US and the US to the country you're in.
This country needs diplomats and historians and researchers that will understand it, that will say, oh, hell yeah, oh, Macedonia, it's a 2 hours country. Yes, but, it would be sad for a country like Macedonia, indeed a beautiful country, and with very good people, wonderful people, big hearts, and welcoming and open and friendly, it would be a pity for this country to go down the drain because, there was a diplomat somewhere who said, oh, come on, I don't have the time for it. It is important to pay attention to the local culture. It's important to pay attention to what their local experts say, because I guarantee you that 90%, at least 90% of the locals have their loyalty in Washington and not with their respective ethnic group or the party of their political affiliation. Their loyalty is in Washington. I guarantee you that. And it would be stupid for a country like this to go down the drain because, they have to check everything and that they don't trust people, because everything is about trust.